Where did you first get the documentary bug?
It was a big mistake. I didn't plan for it. It is sort of like, oh, I'll try one bump of heroin. What could hurt, right? Just once.
Yeah.
I made a documentary called Trekkies because an actress I met named Denise Crosby, who was in my first feature film, a narrative, we had lunch a few years later, and she pitched the idea to me, hey, someone should make a documentary about these Star Trek fans, because she'd been going to conventions as an actor and said, these people are like entertaining. And we couldn't believe no one had done it yet. It seems so obvious. And yes, of course. So we brainstormed a little bit and schemed, we've never done this before. We have no idea how to make a documentary, but, as the naive often say, how hard can it be?
Mm-hmm.
And then you dive in and it's really hard, especially if you don't know what you're doing. And we just stumbled into it, watched a bunch of documentaries, absorbed what we could, made a lot of mistakes, which I learned from, and then put in a book about how to make documentaries. I made the mistakes so you don't have to. So I just kind of stumbled into it.
What was the biggest challenge you faced on that one, looking back on it? Did you realize now that was our biggest hurdle?
The biggest challenge is always finding the money to pay for it.
Okay.
Every time, even for Ken Burns, he said it was a challenge raising money. No matter where you'd think a guy like in his career at this point, with dozens of films, they'd be writing him checks, but he says he still has to go searching for the finishing funds on every project.
One of the things when I saw Trekkies for the first time was I was really impressed with the skill with which you, first the humanity that you treated every subject in it with, but also your balance of the humorous and the serious elements within it. I imagine you found that in the editing. Am I right?
I guess so. I mean, it's something innate. I don't really consciously set out to I'm going to be balanced, or I'm going to be funny. It's what I look for in my own viewing. I look for films where the filmmaker is not lying to me. I want a genuine take on something. They can take a position. In fact, it's better when you take a position with a documentary. You should have a point of view. If you are just presenting both sides equally, you're much less likely to have an audience than if you make a position and lay out the evidence and let the audience decide. Sure, but I look for that in a film, and so my films, I guess, are an embodiment of me. I'm the filmmaker. You're getting my perspective on the world. Any piece of art is the artist's perspective on the world. They're saying, here's how I see the world. And my documentary is me looking at people. I'm amused, and I'm obsessed, and I'm interested in human behavior. I find it fascinating and really funny. And so that's what happens when I process what I'm making. And then, of course, in the editing, that's where I'm refining that point of view.
So when you sit down with someone, what techniques do you use to make your interview subjects comfortable and willing to open up to get the sort of responses you need?
First, you want to start off with some flattery. Obviously, thank you for being here. I loved your book. It's such a good book. I loved your movie. I loved your acting. I loved whatever. I love I love that brooch. Find something to compliment. People love it. You bond with someone who likes you. We like people who like us. And so that interview is going to be a connection between two people. And it's nice when it's like a friendly connection where they're not hiding their true selves. So you want someone to feel comfortable enough so that they'll open up and give you the real stuff and not try to pre-edit their image. Those interviews don't work so well when someone's trying to make sure that they're going to come off a certain way. They need to be open and just, you're going to take what they give you and edit it and make them look good, ideally, or give them a genuine, honest portrayal, but you want them to feel comfortable. Another way to do that is to share something about yourself before you start. Maybe a tragedy you experienced if you're talking about their tragedy, or a funny event that happened to you if you're talking about, but keep it short because they are there to talk. You're there to listen. So mainly you ask a question and then just shut up and let them fill the space.
How long did it take you to learn to shut up? Because I'm not sure I've learned that yet.
It's so hard, especially for men. Men are the worst. I mean, I made a documentary about relationships, and that's almost the number one thing I learned from marriage therapists is that your partner needs to be heard. And men typically try to fix things because that's what we do, right? But your partner doesn't need you to fix them. Usually when they're telling you something, or if let's say you've got a wife, she's complaining about her boss, she doesn't want you to say, "Oh, why don't you quit? Why don't you do this? Why don't you do that?" That's going to make her feel worse. Yeah. She wants you to just show empathy. And so in an interview, you want to do the same thing. Show empathy, but don't intrude. Just nod. Yeah. Oh, that must have been awful. Tell me more about how that felt. Instead of interrupting and trying to guide them, just ask the question, leave the space, and provide silent empathy because you don't want your voice all over their soundtrack.
Right. How much pre-interviewing do you do, and do you like that or not?
I used to do a lot of pre-interviewing. On Trekkies, we did a lot because it was expensive to shoot film. We made that in 16 millimeter film. Oftentimes, we would rehearse what they're going to say and get the soundbite we needed kind of ready, and then say action, have them say it, and then cut, and then move on, or maybe say it in a couple different ways. But now, it's much more typical to just let the camera roll because we're shooting video, maybe multiple cameras. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a better way generally because you might get things you didn't expect. I'd rather have a lot of extra footage that I can't use and yet get that moment that I wouldn't have had otherwise than if I'm trying to save my video. But that said, you want to know what you're going there to get. You don't want to shoot a bunch of things that are useless because you've got to sit in the editing room or your poor editor has to go through all of this stuff. So you do need to plan it out. And there's nothing wrong with preparing the person, pre-interviewing them.
When I, early in my career, I was a PA on a documentary that HBO was doing here in the Twin Cities. It was about hockey goalies, I think, and suicide. And I'd never been on a documentary set like that. And the director of it literally would say, when we talked on the phone, you said the following sentence, would you say that again? Which appalled me at the time because well, let him really talk. But then like you say, he was shooting 16 and he had to get what he had to get. But now, a million years later, having done hundreds of corporate interviews, I'm absolutely on your side of let the camera run, know what it is you want to get, but also, I remember we were wrapping up an interview with a father of someone who I think she had become ill, but she was fine now. And I said, okay, well, that's just been great, Dave. Thank you for talking to me. And the sound man, I was about to cut, and the sound man said, John, I just feel like Dave wants to say something else. And I said, oh, yeah, we're still rolling. Go ahead, Dave. And then he said the sentence that we needed for the whole video. And the sound man had seen that because he was paying attention to the person that I was interviewing. I had not seen it. And I got better later on at seeing that. But it's finding that balance between we're done and we're almost done, but you're about to see something brilliant that's, I guess you can only get from having done it.
I agree, yes. I've oftentimes said to someone, that was a great story or a great thing you just said. Could you say it again? Because it's so important, I want to have you try again, and maybe we'll get it a little more concise this time. Mm-hmm. Or if you're in your mind, you're thinking they didn't quite deliver it the way you wanted. I might even suggest, why don't you start by saying, that time I was riding my bike and finish the sentence. I'll guide them because I'm pre-editing in my head. How am I going to use this soundbite? Yeah. Can I use it? Is it usable, or should we try again? That's very common. And they like that because they want to come off well and they want a second chance to say the thing better. So everybody wins. And by the way, did you meet Gump Worsley?
I did not. This was a high school hockey thing, there wasn't a professional hockey video. But I was surprised that at the end of the day, they gave me all the film to take over to Delving Labs. Like, I'm just a PA. You're giving me everything to take to the place? It seemed like they were giving an awful lot of trust to this kid who didn't know what he was doing. But you raise an interesting point because as you're interviewing, you are both directing and editing at the same time. I think if you're good at it, you're figuring out yes, no, yeah, I can use, no, I can't. And that's a weird dichotomy. How do you balance both those things? Be in the moment, but also be in the editing suite at the same time in your head.
That's the hardest thing, especially if you're a one-man band or a one-person band, or maybe it's you and a sound person. But I've often, it's been just me with the person that I'm interviewing, and so I've got to make sure it's in focus. I have to remember to turn off the autofocus. I've got to ride the levels, ride the volume. I've got to remember to ask the question, and I have to listen to what they're saying in case I want to go with a follow-up. Doing all these things at once. I've got to remember that the lighting, if the lighting changes during the shot, I've got to fix the lighting because the sun moved. So many things are happening. And so you just practice. You get better every time you do another one, and it starts to become second nature. But the most important thing, after making sure it's in focus and the sound is good quality, is to listen to what they say, exactly like your sound person. That's what a great advantage to have someone who is paying attention like that, and a good team member to remind you, or to oftentimes, I mean, every interview you should end with, is there anything else you'd like to add? Is there anything that we missed? Or is there anything else you'd like to say? Many of the best sound bites I've collected came in those moments when it was unprompted by me. They gave me what they needed to give me.
Yeah. I remember being on one shoot for an NCAA athlete. She was a basketball point guard, I think. And we were about halfway through the interview, and I asked a question, and her response was this. She said, well, as I said before, oh, wait, I shouldn't say as I said before, because I bet you're going to cut this up. Let me redo that, and I won't say as I said before. And then she said the statement, and she finished the statement, and I turned to the crew and said, you guys do this much more than I do. Has a subject ever said that? And they said, no. No subject has ever been that aware of the process that they were in, that they fixed on the fly what they were saying because they knew you couldn't use it. Those interview subjects are rare. One technique you talk about in the book is something that started with Errol Morris and ended up being used in corporate America, corporate videos, quite a bit. We called it the interrogator, but that's not quite the word that he used. What did he call it?
Oh, the interrotron?
Interrotron. Yeah, we call it just the interrogator, and it's where you've set up a system wherein they're not looking at the camera, they're looking basically at a screen, which is in front of the camera, and they see your face. And so it is a conversation. And with many subjects, I found that really helped break down any sort of barrier, because it's really hard to talk to a camera. It's much easier to talk to someone sitting next to the camera, and the closer they are to the camera, the better your shot's going to be. But having them look right at your face is hugely helpful.
There is a connection that happens, according to Errol Morris, that brings unexpected, well, I don't know, what do you want to call it, electricity between you and your subject, maybe that you might not have when the camera's intruding on the relationship.
Right. Have you ever run into situations where there wasn't a pre-interview and it becomes very apparent very quickly that this isn't going to go anywhere? If you have, what's your response to that, and how do you handle that?
Oh, yeah, there are many times, especially when I was shooting The Nature of Existence. I had 450 hours of footage. I interviewed 170 people, something like that, a lot of people, because I was fishing. I don't know what I'm going to get, and everyone is qualified to have an opinion on why do we exist. So it's worth casting my lure into that part of the lake, even though I'm not sure that there's fish there. I didn't pre-fish it. And when that happens, I just do the interview, and then I thank them and tell them it was great, and then I just don't use it because there's nothing usable in there, and it's part of fishing, right? Not every cast brings in a fish. Your Minnesota viewers are going to understand this metaphor.
Well, I think fishing has got internationally understood. I think I've never seen anyone do it outside of Minnesota, but I've seen pictures. So you mentioned The Nature of Existence. We've talked about Trekkies. You've talked about the relationship documentary. Where do you get your ideas for what to follow? What's going to be your next project? Where does that come from, and how do you know when you have a good fish on the line?
When you become obsessed with an idea, you have a message that is bursting to get out of you. And so you are compelled, I'm compelled to see this through to the bitter end, because it might take 2 years or 4 years or 7 years. The Truth About Marriage took 7 years. Trekkies took 1 year. Trekkies 2 took 18 months. And So in between there, The Nature of Existence took 4 years. The idea has to captivate me enough and obsess me enough to get me there. And then I'm hoping the audience will be just as interested in what I'm obsessed with as I present it to them. That's probably the most important ingredient to the success of a documentary is your choice of subject matter. Because otherwise you might be making a home movie if it's something no one else is going to be interested in, or you're doing it for some reason other than you are captivated by it, because you're the filmmaker, you're the artist, it's your enthusiasm, your excitement that's going to come through and be felt by the audience.
But while you're doing that, and in your case, you're producing, directing, and editing your projects, when do you know that it's done? I mean, on The Nature of Existence, you said you interviewed, 170? I mean, how do you know, well, that's it, I've got all the pieces? How do you make that decision?
Yeah, it's hard sometimes because I had no idea where I was going to end up with some of these films. I'm sort of like an investigator setting out to solve a crime. And so once I solved the crime, then I know where my ending is and I know how to get there, where to get to. I just have to answer the question. For example, The Truth About Marriage, my question was, why are relationships so hard for people? That's the mystery I solved. And once I had solved it for myself by talking to enough marriage therapists and couples and married people and divorced people, a divorce attorney, etc., I had settled in on an answer. And so that's what I present at the end of the film, is what I learned while seeking out that question. Then this is a concept documentary. With a narrative documentary, which is easier to know your ending because it's a story of someone's life, probably, or a slice of someone's life, or a trial with a verdict. Okay, the verdict is the ending. Or it's maybe it's basketball. And so do they win or do they lose at the end? That's your ending, and you're working backward from that. If it's a biography, if they've lived a good 3-act structure in their lives, you've probably got a good documentary there. If they haven't, you either have to manufacture it or find a way to present it. And documentaries many have succeeded despite a lack of a story structure and despite a lack of a solid core question. It's better to have the insurance of a solid story structure, but if you don't have it, you might yet still succeed. Like, I think Trekkies is an example of this. It's a flawed documentary, which does not have a narrative structure. Mm-hmm. And there's no solid core question asked at the beginning, but it was a grand slam as a documentary because it was so funny. And it had a core group of people that were going to automatically be interested in the film. So we had those two high cards, despite the fact that we didn't have what typically a great documentary has, which is a narrative structure just the same as a screenplay has.
It feels like sometimes you're just rolling the dice, not you, but a documentary filmmaker, that you're going to go into something and something's going to happen and you're going to end up with either the jinx, where he confesses on tape at the end of your documentary, which you certainly could not have put in your pitch if you're that director, or the folks who were working on the Alec Baldwin documentary about his trial, where the judge threw it out on the first or second day. At that point, you no longer have a documentary. What would you recommend someone do when they're going out to pitch a documentary to sell their investors or the network or whatever on the idea of how do you sell something that doesn't exist yet, even in anything more than like a one-page document?
The best way to sell it is to make them feel the story in the room, and you act it out and you bring the excitement because you're excited by it, and maybe you've done one interview already as a test. That's often where I get the feel when I'm interviewing that person. I feel it. I feel like I've got something here, or I feel like it's not going anywhere. I started a documentary about Scott Hansen, local Minneapolis comedian, and we did one interview, and I just didn't feel it because I think he was trying to present an image of himself. He wasn't willing to be open. And so I didn't get excited and we didn't really keep going. But the first interview, the first footage we shot of Trekkies, we felt it. We knew we had something. The first interview I did about this existentialist question, why do we exist? I loved talking to people about this, the way you do in a dorm room in college when you're talking about the big questions, why are we here and what's our purpose and What am I supposed to do with my life? That gets me excited. It gets people excited in life and death, talking about death. What happens when you die? Does the soul exist? If so, where is it lodged inside your brain? Is there a compartment? Just fun questions. So I had a sense that that was going to turn out okay, even though I didn't know my ending when I started, because the idea was so gripping. I mean, it's gripped people, existentialist philosophers, for centuries. I'm not the first person to ask this question or try to figure it. I'm just one of thousands or millions, who knows? So I was tapping into something. I felt it. But when you're in a pitch meeting, as you're asking, you have to make them feel the excitement either through your core question or the character description. If it's a character piece, then you're going to tell a story about this person. Who is this documentary about? I asked Ken Burns about that. How do you make a documentary about things like like a bridge? His first film was about the building of the Brooklyn Bridge. And he said, you cannot make documentaries about things. It has to be about people. And so that documentary is about the family, the Roebling family that built that bridge, and their struggle to complete the job through difficulties and challenges and near-death experiences. That makes it interesting and exciting. If you love the film, like a film about an octopus, right? It's not as exciting unless you learn about the person who gets infatuated with a particular octopus and it's his life, or a documentary about a TV show. It's going to have a limited interest to fans of the TV show. But if you want a wider audience, you do a film about the fans themselves, about the people. The stories are about the people involved. Someone who collects owl figurines like my aunt did, she would have been a great subject. The owl figurines, who cares? It's a 5-minute short. Look, a bunch of owl figurines. But the person, the mindset behind someone who thinks they have to fill their house with owls, that's interesting.
And it gives you lots of cutaway shots too, which is nice.
Always get your cutaways.
Yes. For your documentaries, you're directing and editing. But in the case of the Comedy Store series, you were just, I don't mean to say just an editor on it, but you weren't directing it. What is that process like when it's a process that I dealt with in corporate all the time. I would go out and interview the subjects, and I bring it back to my editor and say, here's my notes, here's the best stuff, but have at it. And he would create something great that wasn't what I had necessarily intended, but he found the best stuff in the footage and turned it into a 5-minute story. In the case of the Comedy Store, you're probably handed hundreds of hours of interviews with very interesting people and very funny people. What was your process for creating all those segments and deciding this goes, this stays? Because I'm guessing you could probably have done a couple more hours of just stuff that's funny.
Sure, we could have done more episodes. There were plenty of footage. I was hired by Mike Binder, who I had worked with before. I had edited his feature films in the past, and he had never made a documentary. So when he first asked me, I was busy. I was cutting Curb Your Enthusiasm, and I said, I can't do it. But if you can wait 11 months, I'll be free. So he hired another editor and started on the footage. And when that 11 months was over, they had crap. They had nothing. They still didn't know what they the beginnings of an episode, but he was flailing around trying to figure out what to do. So I said, I'm available now. Let's do it. So I jumped in, and the first thing I showed Mike was my rules for doing interviews. I said, Mike, you got to just shut up. Ask the question and shut up. Let them fill the space, especially when it's awkward. That's great. They'll come up with things they wouldn't have said if you had just been quiet. That's number one. Number two, each episode needs a theme. And this is the biggest problem that I've seen, the biggest mistake that documentary filmmakers will make is they don't know what their theme is. What is a theme? It's the idea or the premise behind the moral of the story. It's the idea you're trying to express. Like in each of the 5 episodes has a different theme. To take one is called, one episode, this is very easy to example, called The Wild Bunch. And so we took it was about the wildest comedians who ever performed at the Comedy Store. And we used some footage from the movie The Wild Bunch. And once it had a theme, then I knew what to cut and how to link things together. And once Mike started revising his outlines with that in mind, they started to take shape. And cutting the episodes made sense. You need to know your theme. I would write it down on a piece of paper, put it on the wall, because that's your roadmap. That's where you're going. And every scene should be connected to that theme in some way, or it probably doesn't belong in that episode or in the movie.
And it actually probably made it a whole lot easier to edit, because you could just immediately go, nope, yep, nope, yep.
It's your roadmap. Otherwise, you're just surrounded by a forest of footage. And what do? I mean, there are tricks, like you start putting like with like, and grouping them in your bins, and eventually you might start connecting like segments with like segments as you're building scenes. But when there's a narrative, it's easiest. There's an episode that's about the comedy strike, which happened, and so that gave us a very specific timeline of what's happening and who caused the strike and why, what they were asking for. Now we've got protagonists and antagonists. The antagonist is the owner of the store, Mitzi Shore, who doesn't want to pay them what they want as comedians. And that makes it easier from a narrative perspective, because what is a narrative, right? You have a protagonist or a small group of protagonists, and an antagonist or a small group, and a goal. The protagonists have a goal, and there's obstacles to that goal. Now we watch to see how they succeed or fail. That made that episode much clearer from that point of view, like what's it about.
One part of the book that I found just fascinating, and I'm wondering if the publisher gave you any pushback on it, because it is sort of its own mini book right in the book, which is the whole process of coming up with a distribution deal for Trekkies. And it's a long segment, but it disabuses you of any glamour of Hollywood, of, oh, we went to Sundance and they loved the film when we signed it, and 2 months later it was in theaters. This is pages and pages and pages of the process of taking what you know to be a valuable asset and getting it to the right people and getting it out. So first question is, did the publisher push back on that at all?
No, they were remarkably compliant, helpful, because I'd done one book with them already, and they felt pretty happy about me doing a second one in a similar vein. And I had case studies in that book also, but not like, this is 4 chapters. You're right. The 4 chapters after I say at one point, I think, and at the end of chapter 10 or whatever it was, okay, the how to make a documentary part of the book is over. The next 4 chapters are, once you have finished, here's a case study in trying to sell your documentary, because it took us 9 months from our first distributor screening to sign a contract. There is no immediate, Sundance. I mean, Sundance turned us down. And so you have to persevere despite these problems toward a sale. The Sundance mega sale is like winning the lottery, and you're not likely to win the lottery. So you need backup strategies and backup plans. And we had tried lots of things, and it took us a long time and a lot of difficulties, infighting amongst ourselves, to finally get to a point where we succeeded and got such a successful sale.
Those chapters, I mean, the whole book is great for anyone who wants to make a documentary, but it's also really good for anyone who wants to make a thing, particularly a film or a TV show or something. You're trying to make a pilot, you're trying to do something. It's unvarnished as to what it takes to do these things. And then you get to those 4 chapters, you realize this is for anybody who's got a film under their arm, whether it's a short or a feature. Here's what you need to be prepared to face. And it's something that, I've always said that the problem with independent filmmaking is that we only see the successes. And it's like having a cancer study where they don't tell you about the ones who died. We only tell you about the ones who lived. And this is a great product because, look at this. This is what they did and they all lived. But there's so many that died because people don't understand the process. And that's what I love about that section of the book, is it really just says this is not easy and you need good people on your side.
And persistence. You've got to be able to it's a marathon in most cases. You need to make sure your film sells. No one else is going to have the motivation to push your film over the finish line more than you. You got to be in training to be that strong. You got to make your short films. You got to suffer a little bit, And that just makes you stronger. We were motivated to succeed, despite being turned down by Sundance and Telluride and Toronto and the New York Film Festival. All the big ones at the beginning of the season turned us down. We finally got some success with the Hamptons Film Festival and the AFI Los Angeles Film Festival, and we were able to use those to help us get where we wanted to go. But boy, it would have been so much nicer if we got into Sundance, and it was the rave of Sundance, and it was easy. But here's a plan for those where that doesn't happen. There's a film agent I interview in the book, Glenn Reynolds, who said that he said, I don't need film festivals to sell your movie. Filmmakers like to go to film festivals, but there's just buyers, and it comes down to the product. Is it good? Who's in it? What's their social media reach now? And, okay, you did a film festival. That's great. That doesn't hurt necessarily. And but these first three, and the poster, what's the hook? What's the marketing going to do? Those are more important than how many film festivals. We did 50 film festivals. The buyers don't really care. But if you got picked up some rave reviews and won some awards, that shows someone else has validated your work, and so that's what you're hoping for.
And you're not doing that in a vacuum. If I remember the timeline, you're working on your feature Suckers in there somewhere as well. That's happening at the same time. So it's not like you once said to me something like, it's good to have a lot of irons in the fire. You just don't want to have too many because you put the fire out. And you've always been, you don't remember saying that?
I do, yes. That sounds like me.
Yeah, it is you. It was you. And I've remembered that ever since and have tried to have a number of irons in the fire, but not too many. But that's one of the things. I mean, I think you sort of just say it in passing in that section that, I'm also working on Suckers and that's happening. But you've always had sort of multi-paths happening at the same time. How has that helped your career as both a documentary filmmaker and a TV director and a TV editor and now an author?
Yeah, you need to continually reinvent yourself and be trying new things and have multiple projects and have the stamina to work on them all and push them forward, because that's who you're competing with. You're competing with people who are like that. They're working just as hard as you are. I mean, a workaholic is just someone who works harder than you do, right? If you accuse someone of being a workaholic, that means you're probably a little lazier than they are. Okay, that's fine. Maybe, you can make what you need out of life not working as hard, and my hat goes off to you. But that doesn't work for me. What works for me is maybe it's that Scandinavian work ethic I picked up growing up in Minnesota. I feel like a complete loser if I haven't put in my work during the day. By the end of the day, I better have pushed that ball down the field some more, or I'll feel guilty. And so that helps motivate me. So I work every day on something, whether it's writing the book or making a documentary or editing a feature or right now I'm editing a Netflix series. I'm doing all those things, and my delayed gratification carrot is hanging there for me. Once I finish, I'm going to go to Bali. So I go to Bali every year once I've earned it. And now you might say, oh, you're crazy. No one should work that hard. Well, it's a very competitive world. And so you need to work just a little bit harder than the one you're competing against.
Yes. I believe it was William Goldman who quoted some basketball coach as saying to their player, anytime you're not practicing, the guy you're going to go up against is. So you need to get out there and practice.
No different in the film business. Film business is the same, if not even more cutthroat.
Yeah. Yes. Okay, 2 last questions on this, and then I'm going to let you go. So what's the biggest mistake that you think someone starting out as a documentary filmmaker is likely to make?
One of them is to give up your ownership. You should always keep, if you can, own your projects, own your product, because it's a property. And if you own it, then you can continually relicense it over your lifetime. I know a filmmaker who made the biggest mistake you can make, which is he sold his movie in perpetuity to a distributor. Now it's gone. They'll never get it back again. So you want to license whatever you've made to a distributor for 2 years, 4 years, 5 years, 7 years. with Trekkies, we had a 20-year license, 25 if unrecouped, but that's because they paid us so much money that they bought that many years, but it was still a license. And so Trekkies came back to us a few years ago. And so we restored it to HD. Mm-hmm. It had never been released in HD yet. And we relicensed it to a new company for another period of time.
You did the same thing with Suckers, didn't you? You bought Suckers back and...
I did. I bought it, yes. A company, the same company that I made Trekkies with, made Suckers with me. And they set up a corporation to own the film, which is typically what they do. Every film has a corporation that owns that film. And that's where the money from the investor goes. And that's where the profits, if any, come out of. And in that case, Suckers never reached profit while they owned it. It cost about $500,000 to make, and it probably made back $250,000 from an HBO sale and an IFC sale and home video. And we had a distributor that went bankrupt, so we had to chase them. But at the end of probably like 15 years after we made the film, the company that I worked with, Neo Motion Pictures, they were going to close their doors. They were retiring or going off to do different things. And they were shutting down the company they had made that owned the film. So if they just shut down the company, then suddenly it goes into the public domain because there's no ownership. The entity that owned it no longer exists. Mm-hmm. Nothing owns it, meaning anyone can own it. So I said, wait, guys, sell it to me, which they did, and I will restore the film, which I did. I paid for the restoration. I collected what elements remained. Some had been thrown away, but I had enough. The key elements still existed, so I was able to re-scan it and remix it and marry it together and find a distributor. And actually, I put it on. It's on Amazon Prime. I put it there myself, so I collect the money directly now after putting my money into it. So be an owner. Own your films, and if you can't, be a co-owner, so at least you're part of where the money goes first. I mean, ideally, you want the money to go to you and have all your profit participants chase you for the money instead of you chasing them for the royalties.
Okay, one last question. Someone has read your book. They've properly packed all their gear. They're going off to begin shooting. What's the one last piece of advice you'd give them before the door on the airplane shuts?
Buy a copy of the Documentarian for everyone on your crew. That's the first part of the advice, and have them all read it. Be prepared for your interview. Practice at home before you get there. Set up your camera and your audio and do a practice interview so that it's second nature by the time you get there. Yeah, maybe do a test interview on someone who's not your main interviewee, so that you have done a dry run and you've tested all the equipment, you've tested your questions, you've refined your approach, and so you're ready for the big league.
Well, this has been great, Roger. Is there anything I've forgotten to ask you?
Yes. The names of all my projects. The last book was Cut to the Monkey, about editing and comedy, and this book is called The Documentarian. And I am working on another book, and I will probably, until the day I keel over, while I'm in it, hopefully I'll die fishing up in Canada.
Mm-hmm. And they won't find you for days and days and days.
It would be only fair if I fell in the water and the fish ate me after I've been eating them for years.